In my video about the so-called Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, I covered both the political and military aspects up to the downfall of the German 6th Army at the beginning of February 1943. This discussion, on the other hand, deals with Army Group North, focusing on the year 1943. Here is its organization in that year. It is noticeable that its two armies, the 16th and the 18th, were made up solely of infantry and Luftwaffe field divisions. However, this had looked quite different. On the 22nd of June, 1941, when Panzer Group 4 under Colonel General Erich Höppner was still under its command, with the 41st Army Corps, commanded by General of Panzer Troops Georg Hans Reinhard, consisting of 3 tank divisions and 3 infantry divisions, including the Totenkopf Division. These 3 armies, the 16th, 18th, and 4th Panzer, were, simply put, to advance along the Baltic Sea coast northward, through the Baltic states toward Leningrad, and, in coordination with Finnish units coming from the north, capture the city. But just 3 weeks later, on the 17th of July, 1941, Army Group North, under the supreme command of Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, realized that the demands set out by Hitler in his Directive Number 21, that the Wehrmacht should defeat the Soviet Union in a rapid campaign, could likely not be fulfilled, and therefore the offensive could no longer be carried out in one go, but had to be conducted in stages. The reasons for this were threefold: the increasingly fierce resistance of the Red Army, the size of the operational areas assigned to the Army Group, and the strength of their own forces. Then, although the initial objectives had been achieved and a large number of prisoners had been taken, the intended and decisive destruction of the Red Army had failed. And it was also not possible, together with the Finns, to capture Leningrad, which has been called St. Petersburg again since 1991. From the 17th of September, 1941, until the 27th of January, 1944, the so-called Siege of Leningrad lasted 900 days and resulted in incredibly high civilian casualties, depending on the source, between 649,000 and 2 million, mostly due to starvation. In the spring of 1942, 8 additional infantry divisions had been assigned to the 2 armies of Army Group North. With this, in July 1942, they were able to completely destroy the Soviet Second Shock Army, which had broken into the German lines in an encirclement battle. However, it must also be considered that at that time, the combat doctrine of the Red Army still applied the rigid defense repeatedly ordered by Hitler. As a result, the previously mentioned Second Shock Army, cut off by a German counterattack, had to remain in its positions from March until the approved breakout on May 24th. And except for 16,000 of their soldiers who managed to break through to their own lines, it was then completely destroyed. But the Red Army was always able to make up for its extreme losses, and in some sections of the front, even significantly reinforce them. And like the other army groups, Army Group North, now commanded by Field Marshal Georg von Küchler since the 17th of January 1942, also had to obey Hitler's preference for a rigid defense. But then, when its overall situation had relatively stabilized by the first half of 1943, despite heavy positional fighting, while the situation at Army Group Center and in the southern sector of the front was figuratively on fire, Army Group North became heavily burdened by the withdrawal and redeployment of several of its major formations. The result was that by the 11th of October 1943, the 16th Army, commanded until then by Field Marshal Busch and subsequently by General of Artillery Christian Hansen, and the 18th Army, led since mid-January 1942 by Colonel General Georg Lindemann, had only 57 tanks and assault guns left by December. As I mentioned, there was also the 8th Panzer Division led by Major General Gottfried Fröhlich on the left in 41, transferred as a colonel with Colonel General Roth to Army Group South, which meant that now the entire Army Group only commanded large infantry units. And at Luftflotte 1, which supported them, commanded until the 28th of June 1943 by Colonel General Alfred Keller, then for 4 days until the 23rd. Of August by General of the Air Force Günther Korten, and from then on by General of the Air Force Kurt Pflugbeil. It didn't look any better. Thus, on the 20th of June 1943, to support the blockade of Leningrad and cover the overstretched 800-kilometer front, it sometimes had only a dozen combat aircraft available. And another circumstance showed what things were really like on the Eastern Front. Because Army Group North, with its lack of motor vehicles and tractors, was a blatant example of what the entire Eastern Army was basically like. It was, in fact, demotorized and reduced to the mobile status of the German Army of the First World War, because until 1918, it too had relied on horses for 90% of its mobility. But now, 25 years later, with the consistently good motorization of the Red Army, the German divisions that depended on horses and sometimes bicycles were no longer able to outmaneuver the enemy quickly. This left them with no other choice but to hold their positions and resist for as long as possible, since any retreat on foot or with horse-drawn carts threatened to end in their destruction. And, as the war went on, that's exactly what happened. In October 1943, when Army Group Center had withdrawn to the Panther line by the 2nd of the month, this not only placed its left neighbor, Army Group North, in an exposed position, but also forced it to extend its front 90 kilometers southward in order to include the vital road and rail network within its operational area. I just mentioned the Panther line. This defensive line, also called the Eastern Wall, had been established on the 12th of August, 1943, by order of the Führer, and ran along the entire Eastern Front. In case of emergency, it was meant to serve as a fallback position for the German army groups. However, as early as spring, the commander of Army Group South, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, had already demanded such a fallback position. In order to counter the increasingly noticeable shortages of personnel, equipment, and weapons with the then simpler so-called front straightening, and thus to free up forces for defense and counterattacks. But Hitler had categorically rejected such a fallback position for months, because in his view, the mere existence of such a system of positions would encourage retreats. But after the failed German Operation Citadel in July 1943, the Battle of the Kursk salient, and the subsequent Soviet offensive, he nevertheless issued the order on the 12th of August 1943 for the, quote, immediate expansion. Here is one of the bunkers. Construction began on September 8th. Around 50,000 people were used for this in the area of Army Group North, mainly recruited from the local civilian population. But due to a lack of materials and personnel, the Eastern Wall could not be completed in such a short time. Therefore, it consisted mainly of 6,000 field fortifications, including 800 concrete bunkers. By the summer of 1944, the position system shown in green hatching had been widely breached along its entire length by the Red Army. By the end of September 1943, German intelligence had learned that the Red Army would attack in the area of the dividing line between Army Groups North and Center. For a long time, this area had been one of the weakest sections on the Eastern Front, secured only by a weak infantry regiment whose 1,200 soldiers were spread out over nearly 20 kilometers. It was now common knowledge that the Red Army conducted careful reconnaissance before attacks, and often preferred to launch assaults on the dividing lines between large German units, as these often had gaps. Then, on the 6th of October, the Soviet attack, launched in bad weather, came as a complete surprise to the German units deployed there, especially since both the troops and the aerial reconnaissance had lost track of the Russian troop movements due to the bad weather of the past few days. Within days, the Red Army had taken the city of Neville. Now there was a wide gap between the two army groups. However, the heavily outnumbered German units, following an order from Hitler, managed to hold the flanks and close the gap between the army groups with counterattacks. Despite ongoing attacks, the Red Army was not able to turn its initial breakthrough into a greater success by the end of 1943. In addition to his order to hold the line, Hitler accused the generals that the Soviet breakthrough must have been due to the lack of willingness to cooperate between the units of the two army groups deployed there. And this, even though they should have known that the Red Army often launched its attacks on the areas of separation lines, meaning the boundaries of responsibility. Of course, the commanders were aware of the tactics successfully practiced by the Soviet army. After all, unlike the gentlemen at the high command of the army, they had repeatedly experienced these tactics firsthand. But due to Hitler's unimaginative orders to hold positions and the dramatic lack of reserves, such breakthroughs could not be effectively countered as long as it was unclear in which direction the Soviet units would advance. However, even among those responsible in the army group, there was no determined resistance to the accusations of the First World War Corporal Hitler, as was often the case before and after. Instead, they continued to obey in silence, almost submissively. Parallel to the events at the front, in September 1943, for the first time in Germany, the growing shortage of German workers for the war industry became apparent, which was now being compensated for by forced laborers coming from various countries. By the end of the war, there were around 7.6 million so-called foreign workers in Germany. But with the increased demand for qualified German workers and their resulting indispensability known as UK status, in September 1943, for the first time during the war, the strength of the Eastern Army also dropped below 2.5 million men. However, this number does not include the Luftwaffe field divisions or the Waffen-SS units. If you look at the Army strength from the beginning of the war against the Soviet Union until October 1943, there had been losses of 3.34 million men by that time. This number includes the total of those killed, missing, including those taken prisoner of war, and those wounded so severely that they had to be removed from the battlefield for further treatment. But the length and quality of the recruits' training had also declined. This realization led to an ultimately unsuccessful remark by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge to Hitler in October. According to his assessment, a large part of the replacements for the field army would not withstand a determined attack by the Red Army. And in fact, in addition to the condition of the depleted infantry regiments, the quality of many German infantry units had declined to such an alarming degree that likewise, in October 1943, Colonel General Heinz Guderian, in his capacity as Inspector General of the Armored Troops, had proposed that armored reserves be immediately established with Army Group North in order to better support the infantry and to repel the Soviet infantry, which repeatedly attacked in mass formations. However, Guderian's proposal had been rejected by Hitler, as it contradicted his doctrine of stubbornly holding positions. As for Army Group North, its personnel situation had developed catastrophically. Due to constant transfers to other, more threatened sections of the Eastern Front, it had to give up 40% of its divisions in just the last 6 months of 1943. What remained was a hodgepodge of units. The battle-hardened but also battered infantry regiments were reinforced by hastily assembled Luftwaffe field divisions, which had only received infantry training shortly before being sent to the front, were unarmored, poorly motorized and equipped, and of questionable value. They promptly suffered heavy losses during Soviet attacks, unless they had been destroyed. As a result, Luftwaffe infantry regiments on the Eastern Front suffered casualty rates of up to 80%, At the end of March 1944, Army Group North received the calculation prepared by the OKW Foreign Armies East Department under General Galen. Alone between September and December 1943, the Red Army lost 1.2 million soldiers, killed or captured. In comparison, the German losses amounted to 243,743 killed. However, in contrast, the Red Army's frontline and reserve strength had grown to 5.5 million soldiers. In addition, they were able to draft 3 times as many men each year as the Germans, and in the territories they had regained, they had even gained about 600,000 more men. While the total losses of the Eastern Army, including the wounded and missing, had reached a similar number during this period. And another piece of bad news was the strong networking that had now been established between the various strategic fronts of the Red Army, which gave them completely different opportunities to concentrate their forces. While the Wehrmacht determined that, for a similar undertaking as Foreign Armies East, it would have had to transfer at least 30% or more of its total strength additionally to the east. Meanwhile, the disillusioned commander of Army Group North, Field Marshal von Küchler, had ordered accelerated preparations for his army group to withdraw to the Panther line. And, remembering the fate of the 6th Army, which had first been encircled and then destroyed, he had kept 2 sectors open to allow for a possible breakout if necessary. One in the area of the 18th Army near Leningrad, the second with the 16th in the north of Neville. However, he also had serious doubts whether he could hold them for long in the event of a major Soviet offensive. In contrast, however, in the Army High Command led by Hitler, they were convinced that the Red Army had lost so many soldiers during the spring and summer battles in Ukraine that a major attack by them in the north was unlikely before spring. Therefore, Hitler had expressly forbidden Küchler to withdraw his army group to the Panther line. This left the field marshal with no other option but to stay at his headquarters, the former Führer headquarters Wasserburg. Near Pskov, about 290 kilometers southwest of Leningrad and close to the border with Estonia, he had no choice but to wait for the Soviet offensive with resignation. After having to transfer 2 of his best divisions at the beginning of January 1944 to Army Group South, which had been bearing the main burden of the fighting on the Eastern Front for a year, Küchler faced with around 250,000 men of the 16th and 18th Armies, supported by Army Detachment Narva, the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, and 5 infantry divisions with a total of 385 tanks, around 2,400 guns and mortars, now 57 Soviet major formations with well over 1 million soldiers of both sexes, 1,580 tanks, 20,180 guns, and the units of the Baltic Fleet. However, when it comes to the strength figures of both sides, you really can't rely on the numbers given in books or on the internet, as these are apparently given arbitrarily and sometimes differ by several 100,000. On the 14th of January, 1944, as Army Group North had feared, the Soviet Leningrad-Novgorod offensive began, lasting until the 1st of March. It was the first of the 10 so-called Stalinist blows, with simultaneous attacks on the 18th. Army near Leningrad and Novgorod. But if the Germans had assumed that the goal would only be the liberation of Leningrad, they were mistaken. Because Stalin's goal had been to advance all the way to the borders of the Baltic states. Nevertheless, the 18th Army, despite being clearly outnumbered, was able to repel the attacks until the 17th. Until, in the north between Krasnoye Selo and Pushkin, shown here in the picture, the Red Army finally achieved a breakthrough. One day later, on the 18th, the German front west of Leningrad completely collapsed, and Novgorod was on the verge of encirclement. This had led to a serious crisis for Army Group North. But when Hitler once again refused to authorize a retreat, Field Marshal von Küchler who couldn't resolve the situation without reserves, independently ordered a partial withdrawal. When Novgorod was finally encircled on the 19th, the OKH reluctantly approved the breakout of parts of the 28th. Jaeger Division, the 1st. Luftwaffe Field Division, and the Cavalry Regiment North. However, the attempt failed, and 3,000 soldiers were taken prisoner. Then, on the 20th, the city was occupied by Soviet troops without a fight. From then on, the German units had to keep retreating under constant pressure from the Red Army, so that, on the 26th, Soviet troops were able to occupy the important main railway line to Moscow. And with that, after almost 900 days, the siege of Leningrad was ended. The next day, the 27th, while von Küchler and other army group and army commanders had been summoned to a hastily convened commanders' meeting in Königsberg to be bombarded by Hitler with the usual platitudes about belief in victory, at the same time their soldiers in the 18th Army heard the 100,000 shells fired by Soviet artillery at 9:30 as 90 minutes of fireworks to celebrate their liberation of Leningrad. Already a week earlier, on the 21st of January, Field Marshal von Küchler, faced with the danger that Russian partisans could block his retreat, requested permission from the Army High Command to immediately retreat to the Panther line, shown in blue-green. However, Hitler rejected his request with a tirade against the general staff, specifically targeting, in his words, the supposedly, quote, slackened Army Group North. His main point was that, since crises could arise anywhere at the front, he was against all withdrawals. After all, there was no guarantee that the Panther line wouldn't be breached as well. The Russian, he believed, had to be bled dry in the fighting along the way, as far from the German border as possible. On the 27th of January, the day of the victory salute of the artillery in Leningrad, the 18th, Army had already lost 52,000 men, and its effective infantry strength had dropped to 17,000. And now that it too was facing encirclement, even the OKH could no longer ignore the obvious, but they were still hesitating. But then, on the 29th, the 18th Army, meanwhile split into 3 parts, had been granted permission to retreat by von Küchler without authorization from the Army High Command in order to prevent the complete destruction of the army. By mid-February, they had brought it to the isthmus near Narva and south of Lake Peipus. Although there had been no alternative to this decision, unless one had wanted to share the fate of the 6th Army, von Küchler on the 31st of January 44 was relieved of his command by Hitler and replaced by Colonel General Walter Model. But even Model, who was considered a defensive specialist and brilliant improviser, was confronted here with a situation that could not be handled with normal tactics. Therefore, the loyal Colonel General, who was well regarded by Hitler, used a trick that allowed him to counter Hitler's ideas for a while. He had recently also allowed limited withdrawals, provided that counterattacks would result from them. Model promptly ordered controlled withdrawals to the Panther line in order to repel Soviet advances from there. However, it is more than doubtful that Model ever intended to launch new offensive operations, because he too was too much of an experienced soldier not to have long since recognized the reality of the situation. In any case, by February 17th, the 18th Army, by his order, had withdrawn in relatively good order to the Panther line, from which it was able to repel all Soviet attempts to break through the front via the narrow land strip between Lake Peipus and the Gulf of Finland. And by the 1st of March, the remaining units of the Army Group were also positioned on the Panther line. And despite bombardments, with these leaflets urging them to defect, and ongoing Soviet attempts to capture Narva and Pskov, they were able to hold their positions for the time being. In his defensive success and the resulting relative stabilization of the front, Model was also aided by 2 crucial circumstances. First, that Hitler initially always gave the generals he had newly appointed a bit more leeway, And second, the lack of experience of the Soviet high commands of the involved fronts, who proceeded rather hesitantly instead of seizing the opportunity. Although their divisions had advanced along a 600-kilometer wide front, pushing about 180 to 280 kilometers south and west, and destroying 26 Axis divisions, including 3 completely. They did not exploit their superior mobility, enabled mainly by the extensive British-American Lend-Lease deliveries of motor vehicles and combat equipment for a bold encirclement operation. Instead, they continued to carry out methodical frontal attacks, which struck the Wehrmacht units hard but did not destroy them. Now, on the Soviet side, the breaking of the siege ring around Leningrad after the long German-Finnish blockade had been received with understandable joy, but this success had come at a very high price. From July to the end of 1943, the Red Army in the north had lost over 260,000 men, including 67,000 dead and missing. And between mid-January and the 1st, March 1944, their Leningrad-Novgorod operation, despite a manpower ratio of 5-1 and an incredible superiority of 13-1, in tanks and assault guns, it cost another 314,000 soldiers, including 77,000 dead and missing. And their attempt in March and April 1944 to break through the Panther line had led to the further loss of around 200,000 men. With that, the Red Army had lost almost 775,000 men from July 1943 to April 1944, which was roughly equal to the total strength of Army Group North. But the Wehrmacht had also suffered heavy losses because of Hitler's stubborn insistence on not allowing orderly retreats to the Panther line. So the Army Group North lost from January 10th to the 1st. Of March, almost 100,000 men, including 29,000 killed or missing. These were losses that Germany could not cope with, given the catastrophic personnel situation. But the apparent success of being able to stabilize the front to some extent had allowed Hitler to continue under the illusion that his strategy was the only correct one. When then the Soviet Dnieper-Carpathian operation, which lasted from September to the 17th of April, 1944, focused on Army Group South, led by Field Marshal von Manstein, the situation had become extremely tense again, and Hitler reacted as usual, and on the 30th of March, he transferred this probably most capable of all field marshals to the Führer Reserve, while at the same time transferring Model, who was promoted to Field Marshal on the same day, to Army Group South, which then received the name Army Group North Ukraine. And since from now on the Red Army had shifted its main focus to the center and the south, Hitler also no longer had much interest in the fate of Army Group North. From the 17th of September 1944, however, the complete destruction of Army Group Center began as part of the Soviet Operation Bagration. And Army Group North had begun its retreat through Riga to Courland, arriving there in mid-January 1945, and in the meantime renamed Army Group Courland, had to allow itself to be encircled by superior Soviet forces on Hitler's orders. The German Emperor had seriously counted on a repeat of what happened in the 7 Years' War. So-called Miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Back then, on the 5th of January 1762, the Russian Empress, who had been successful in the war against Prussia, had died, and her son, Peter III, who was friendly to Prussia, had concluded a peace and alliance treaty with the heavily pressured Frederick the Great, which saved Prussia, believing this would also apply to Hitler. Quote, "Unnatural Soviet-American-British alliance could break apart. Perhaps also due to the imminent death of the United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was trusting towards Stalin but also seriously ill. From late autumn 1944, he had left the Eastern Front relatively exposed, and on the 16th of December, he launched the Ardennes offensive in the west with around 200,000 men and 600 tanks. After its success and the withdrawal of the shocked Western allies from the alliance, the German armored divisions were then to be redeployed to the east. And together with the units in the Courland Pocket, they were to encircle and destroy large parts of the Red Army on the Baltic Sea. The result of this pipe dream, hatched 5 minutes past midnight, was that the Aden offensive was shot to pieces by the United States Air Force after just a few weeks. U.S. President Roosevelt until the 12th of April 1945, and neither his successor Harry S. Truman, center of the picture, nor British Prime Minister Churchill, even remotely, had any intention of making a separate peace with Hitler. As for Army Group North, it had been able to hold its positions until the overall surrender of the Wehrmacht. At times, its two armies had to defend themselves against 16 Soviet armies, with 170 aircraft against 4,700, until there remaining approximately 200,000 soldiers also on the 9th of May 1945 had to begin the march into Soviet captivity.